sprawling railway stations in Moscow that route 1 million passengers a day to and from Europe and Asia. In this vast land, trains carry more passengers than any other means of transportation. Yaroslavsky Station, built under Joseph Stalin, is the western terminus for the most famous train in the country, the Trans-Siberian Railway. It makes 45 stops over an 8-day trip that runs 6,183 miles over, across, and through a continent synonymous with frigid temperatures and impassable terrain. Along the way, it is everything a train can be: a school bus, a taxi, a job. Most of all, it is an essential link to villages like Litsvyanka on the fringe of civilization in the heart of Central Asia. To the people who depend on this train, there is nothing extraordinary about the sight of tracks and tunnels carved through the sheer granite cliffs that rise 1,500 feet above Lake Baikal, where ice lingers till May and temperatures drop to -40 in February. The railroad has been here since 1905. No one remembers life without it. Like a heartbeat, it is quietly taken for granted. Yet a century ago, it was virtually unthinkable that a train would unite Europe and Asia. Here, the terrain and climate are treacherous, the job was enormous, and the costs were staggering. The modern-day equivalent of $50 billion, nearly twice that of landing a man on the moon, to build a railroad through a land just as desolate. In spite of the obstacles, by the end of the 19th century, it was a national imperative to build it.
It sometimes took years for messages and edicts and plans to reach the farthest edges of their empire. Without lines of communication, without an effective internal telegraph system, without a railroad system, Russia was at a serious disadvantage.
The country occupies the largest area on Earth. It stretches from St. Petersburg to the Pacific. It is wider than the breadth of the United States and Canada combined, but only wagon trails had linked it to the capital. Russia needed a railroad to command and control its vast Asian territories. There were constant reports that China planned to overrun Siberia's undefended border. Warships from Japan menaced the Russian coast. Even more troubling were Siberian revolutionaries who demonstrated their desire of breaking away from the capital. By the reign of Alexander III, Russia was adrift in crisis.
Tsar Alexander III came into power when his father was assassinated in 1881. His entire reign was dedicated to the idea of Russia for the Russians, of establishing firmer governmental control over a country that seemed to be slipping out of control. The railroad was the answer to all of this. It was partly military defense, but it was also internal police measures.
Alexander III was determined to build a railroad to move soldiers to and from the hinterland. But he also intended to use it to colonize Siberia. Just as the American Transcontinental Railroad had tamed the West, Russia would tame the East. There was nothing but scattered forts and trading posts. Few people lived here except convicts in exile and Stone Age tribes. The Tsar wanted the same success as America's Transcontinental Railroad, but had none of the economic foundation.
One of the most profound disadvantages that Russia faced in this project was a lack of entrepreneurial tradition. This was not a challenge of technology. They didn't have to invent anything new. It was a challenge of financing and organization.
Russia was a feudal society. Its railroad building experience was limited to a few hundred miles of track with antiquated trains.
It's one thing to project a railroad of 500 or even 1,000 miles. It's quite another to project a railroad that would consume unimaginable quantities of timber, require hundreds of bridges, thousands of miles of rail, millions of tons of iron for spikes and bolts. Even running a few trains daily on a line 6,000 miles long is going to require thousands of cars, hundreds of locomotives, and training a workforce in a country that didn't have a great reservoir of mechanical talent.
No railroad in Russia or the world is as long or as complicated as the one called for in the Trans-Siberian. It had to cross 3 of the world's largest rivers, the world's largest forest, the world's largest lake, in the world's worst climate. Much of the railway was built on permafrost. It is rock solid most of the year, but melts into craters under the stress. They must also tunnel through a mountain chain. Overall, there are countless bridges over ravines and rivers.
The Trans-Siberian Railroad was simply one of the most grandiose enterprises of the 19th century, maybe of all of modern history, more costly than any other peaceful undertaking in the history of the modern world.
Alexander entrusted the Committee of Communication with the task of planning the railroad. But the committee was stymied. They advised the Tsar against it.
They didn't see that the government could afford to build this railroad, and they were right. There wasn't a labor force of an adequate size in isolated Siberia. There weren't steel mills in Siberia to supply the railroad. There weren't supplies of coal.
Impossible or not, the Tsar was determined to have a railroad. When the committee told him it couldn't be built, he dissolved the committee, then entrusted Sergei Witte, the builder of the 600-mile Odessa line, to build the 6,000-mile Trans-Siberian. But the Tsar was naive to think a royal temper could assure success.
A railroad is much more than trains and track. It's not a thing. It's nothing that a Tsar can call into being and then expect to work like some machine that you throw a switch and it goes forward. It's a complex interaction of human beings and parts and pieces extending over thousands of miles.
The longest railroad in the world today and the biggest project of the 19th century began in a cloud of bureaucratic fear. While planners searched for a miracle to build it, the Tsar boasted it was Russia's road to power, the start of a new era of peace and prosperity. The fact was, it would provoke a war and nearly bankrupt the country. As the century ended, many wondered if the railroad was worth its enormous expense, nearly two-thirds the state budget, or if it was just a desperate gamble of a dynasty in its waning days to stay in power. Midnight in Moscow marks the departure of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. A first-class ticket cost $1,200 for the 8-day trip to Vladivostok, but many travel and sleep in berths for under $600. By dawn, the train reaches the Volga and crosses Europe's longest river. On the distant bank is Yaroslav and its 900-year-old cathedral. From here, the train continues on, bound for Siberia and beyond. Trains and train centers like this were once the primary target of German aircraft trying to cut supply lines to the front in World War II. But Yaroslav and the Trans-Siberian were spared because they were out of range. In war, distance protected the train. Yet in building it, distance nearly destroyed it. Its remote location and sheer length drove the cost so high, the project was almost derailed before it began.
I'm sure that the Russians wanted to emulate the best. But as they began to price out this huge, long thing, which was maybe 3 times longer than any transcontinental railroad ever built before, it quickly became apparent they'd bankrupt the Treasury and only get halfway.
In St. Petersburg, the Railroad Committee was grappling with the most difficult detail of all, money. Sergei Witte, the project's point man, had to find a way to build the world's longest railroad on a budget. He had no alternative but to cut the costs of materials and labor and collapse the project's time to completion. The best railroads used a double track made of steel rails that weighed 90 pounds to the yard. He would have to build a single line instead, with rails made of iron that only weighed 49 pounds. The measure reduced costs 75%. Next, timber, not stone and steel, was to be used in all but the widest river crossings. The work had to be done by hand. There was no money for dynamite or machines. And there could be no costly surveys. The royal directive was, just do it.
The government was so desperate, it was almost policy to get it done as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible, but at the same time, whatever it took was the rule.
In March 1891, church bells heralded the 10th anniversary of Alexander's ascension to the throne. It was also the day the Tsar marked to start building the railroad, ready or not. In Vladivostok, the Tsarevich Nicholas arrived to shovel the first spade full of dirt, then attended a gala celebration honoring the project's engineers. Amid music and champagne, the railroad was underway. Back at the capital, Witte mapped out the master plan to complete the railroad within 10 years, as the Tsar had ordered. With the construction season limited to 4 months by the sub-zero winters, Witte had 40 months to build 6,000 miles of track, or 150 miles a day. The prospect was impossible, so he borrowed an idea from Canada's Transcontinental Railroad to build in sections simultaneously. Witte broke the Trans-Siberian down into 6 parts, intending to build them all at once. If all went according to plan, he only needed to build about 25 miles of track per month on each section to succeed. To further speed the project, he scheduled bridge and tunnel construction in winter, when crews wouldn't have to pickaxe frozen earth. The first segment to get started was the Ussuri line, joining Khabarovsk to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. It was the country's most urgent link. The army needed the train to shuttle soldiers along the Pacific coastline to guard against invasion. Supply ships reached the distant cruise after a 40-day voyage from the Baltic to the Pacific. There were horrendous delays, but the real problem was labor. Native Siberian tribes refused to work, calling the railway the Iron Scar. Officials tried to recruit workers from Russian cities, but none were enticed by the offer of free room and board and 12 cents a day to work in Siberia. The government was desperate for able-bodied men.
When we built our transcontinental railroad right after the Civil War, a lot of guys are, mustered out looking for employment. And wages weren't too bad. But in Siberia, you can't afford to pay these people a lot. So you end up with a lot of people, I think, that were either prisoners or economically conscripted.
The bulk of the workforce was Russian convicts. They were barefoot in summer and dressed in thick layers for the spring and fall. A shaved right head indicated a murderer. Beside convicts are free men from China, Persia, and Turkey. The pay was 12 cents a day. Stonemasons recruited from Italy earned $1. Other than work, the men either ate or slept. The food was dismal. Cooks slaughtered pack animals too weak to work to make stews of mule and horse meat. At night, men slept in tents or crude bunkhouses. The convicts were shackled to wheelbarrows to prevent their escape. At first light, everyone was back to the tracks until dark, usually at 10 p.m. in the northern latitudes of Siberia. The routine was repeated until the winter suspended work till spring. In the chains of Siberian prisoners, the railroad found the miracle it needed. The enemies of the state became the builders of the state's most important undertaking. Motivation consisted of unshackling a prisoner and taking a day off his sentence for a day of labor.
They were actually paid fairly well, and they were fed fairly well, and conditions were much better working on the railroad than they were rotting away inside of a prison.
Shackles or not, the prisoners often slipped into town, bringing outrage from the local governor for the mayhem they caused. But the railroad officials were less concerned with conduct and more troubled by the fact that they needed more bodies to work every hour of daylight to the maximum. Imperial soldiers were ordered into service, but refused to work beside criminals and went on strike. Finally, the government invited 15,000 coolies from China. The government's motley labor force pushed on. Construction moved at full speed, but by late spring, it was completely disrupted. The initial surveys failed to reveal a critical detail. The melting rivers, fed by tons of winter ice and snow, had overrun their banks by as much as 15 miles.
In many cases, the engineers who were assigned to survey this 5,000 or 6,000 miles through what was often a trackless wilderness, apparently often would decide that they just really didn't have the time to run every line and figure out every curve. So that in many cases the surveys were, shall we say, imaginary, lines drawn on maps without an engineer ever setting foot in that particular forest or that particular step. Well, by the time the track layers get there, they encounter features like rivers or streams or hills that the surveyors had overlooked because they'd never been there in the first place.
The crew hammered away at the route's 470 arduous miles. But there were more obstacles. The floods turned into swamps that bred disease. Siberian anthrax decimated the pack animals. Mosquitoes transmitted fevers that incapacitated hundreds. Worst of all was an insect barely visible to the human eye.
The Siberian gnats alone would be enough to make most modern human beings go crazy. They were thick, unrelenting. They would get into your clothes. They were a combination of vicious flea and nasty mosquito rolled up into one, and there were billions of them. It became the practice of Siberian railroad workers to literally dress themselves in netting.
Whatever the challenges, Witta's plan was succeeding. The real problem was still the old problem, money. Even with cost cuts, the project needed more. To raise more funds, he kept the news about the railroad's difficulty and delays a state secret.
The Trans-Siberian was accompanied by a major propaganda campaign at the world's fairs of the day, especially intended for French and other foreign investors to see that the country was coming alive.
Investors heard the government stress all the financial advantages of a railroad linking Europe to Asia. They were shown the most opulent interiors of any railroad cars in the world, and told the richest would ride these rails across Asia. There was no mention of the fact the railroad was built on substandard ties and tracks with prison labor and traveled at best 15 miles an hour. The scheme worked. The French anteed up fresh loans, but it was still not enough. Witte ordered the treasury to print as much money as the project needed. Whatever the debt, the railroad would pay it off. All Witte had to do was finish it fast. 5 days after leaving Moscow, the Trans-Siberian Railroad reaches the western bank of the Angara River and the city of Irkutsk, 2,800 miles away. It is the halfway point of the journey east and the largest city in Siberia. Irkutsk is the crossroads of Central Asia for passengers going to Mongolia and China. The arrival of the Trans-Siberian a century ago made the city a trade center. The homes of rich merchants and the churches they endowed still stand. Near the train station is the city's World War II memorial. It's a fitting location. With the Nazi invasion, the Trans-Siberian became a warhorse, moving whole armies to the front. In peace, it is a workhorse. The Trans-Siberian carries the industrial lifeblood of coal, oil, and gas from Asia to the West. The tracks are built to bear the weight of 100 loaded boxcars. Its engines can reach top speeds of 70 miles an hour. The speed and strength of the Trans-Siberian in the 21st century is the stuff of dreams to the railroad committee who built it in 1891. For Sergei Witte, building cheap was a necessity, building quick a strategy. The sooner the railroad was finished, the sooner it could earn money. Money needed to upgrade the tracks and rail bed that, by necessity, had to be cheap to cover 6,000 miles. The linchpin in the strategy was concurrent construction, building the Trans-Siberian in sections all at once. The biggest challenge in crossing the Earth's largest landmass was not the land, but the water.
The supply line for building the railroad ideally comes from both ends. The trains just bring it in on the tracks you've already built, and that's the best way to carry it. But the Trans-Siberian Railway was started at 6 different points. So what they did was bring supplies in by boat, which meant going up to the Arctic Sea, and then coming up one of the rivers.
Ships were slated to drop off construction supplies to crews building east and west, but they never made it. The Arctic Sea was a killer, unlike anything the railroad committee expected. The first supply flotilla was shipwrecked. Thousands of miles of tracks and tons of spikes were lost. The accident set construction back. 6 months after the project began, it was already 2 years behind schedule. The Arctic Sea was dropped as a supply route. The project had to wait for slow-traveling supply trains arriving on provisional tracks. Delayed but not defeated, the work pushed on. A year after the Arctic Sea debacle, the project was resupplied with rails. Crews at the westernmost edge of Siberia forged eastward across the Barabanskaya steppe. In stretches of permafrost, crews built innumerable bonfires to melt the ice-hard soil and sink the track into solid ground. Dynamite would have made it easier, but it wasn't in the budget.
The work of most Siberian track builders was repetitive and very difficult. They didn't have steam shovels. They didn't have access to what we would regard as modern hand tools. They were shaping the earth in the profile for the track and doing so with wooden shovels, with rakes, with small light picks, and in some cases they didn't even have wheelbarrows. They would drag the soil on barrows to where they needed it.
On September 11, 1894, 3.5 years after the start of the project, crews reached the Ob River. It is one of the world's largest rivers. While crews with supplies ferried across the river to continue building east, masons began work. Slowly, the bridges took shape, with stone piers and thick buttresses that slanted outward to deflect the tons of ice that swept downriver at a crushing 6 miles per hour. But the upper section of the bridge was delayed for months.
Every stick of rail, every nut and bolt for the bridges, every piece of metal had to be hauled in from workshops in Moscow or Warsaw or other parts of European Russia.
The bridge beams, bearings, and rivets were packaged into hundreds of boxcars and shipped over months like pieces of a puzzle. The supply trains traveled at speeds no better than a walking pace. Bridge construction took place through the winter. It was a ruthless schedule with deadly consequences.
But you've got problems there with working in the extreme cold. Even with gloves, your hands get cold. You step back to do something and you miss your step on this bridge. You grab for something and it's not there, or your hand isn't working. All of a sudden, there you are down in the river. And it's not a gentle splash that season of the year. It's a thud.
The Russians stoically accepted the loss of 10 men for every river crossing and pushed on. After the bridge was finished came the real dangerous job, testing it. Engineers drove 4 locomotives with 4 loaded freight cars halfway across the span. Barring its collapse, they remained there for 2 hours while structural bend was measured. Then they crossed back and forth, first slowly, then to 15 miles per hour. The Ob River Bridge held. Siberia had made a joke out of building quick. Vast distances and harsh seas had stalled the supply lines. It also brought out the worst of engineering based on economy. Typically, 3,000 ties were used to a mile, but the Trans-Siberian used 2,000 to save money. When combined with a light iron rail, the result was disaster.
If you build a light railroad, you need lots of cross ties that hold it up. This light rail has to bridge from tie to tie, and you get an engine on it. It's going to sag and stretch. Also, Siberia has a very severe climate, and there's a temperature point at which steel becomes brittle, and they hit that in Siberia. So the rails would just pop apart and crumble.
The broken pieces of the railroad were patched back together and work resumed. Even a bad train, argued Witte, is better than no train. But in October, tragedy struck. Alexander III, the man who fired a committee for telling him the Trans-Siberian could not be built, died in a train derailment. Sergei Witte was made a scapegoat and forced to resign by his enemies. The railroad had lost its 2 greatest champions. It fell on Nicholas to complete his father's vision. The summer in Siberia is a gift of warmth and light. In Irkutsk, people spend long evenings by the Angara River, mindful that these are the best days of the year. In 6 months, temperatures will drop to 10 degrees below zero, and the sun will set at 3 o'clock. But winter is Siberia's defining season. For the train to succeed, it had to conquer the climate and sheer size of the continent. By the fall of 1898, it was better than halfway to victory. The Trans-Siberian reached Irkutsk in September 1898. 7 years after the project began, the largest city in Siberia was linked to the capital. The distance of 2,800 miles was longer than the American Transcontinental Railroad, but still less than halfway across Siberia. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas honored his late father with the title Most August Founder of the Great Siberian Railway and erected a statue in his memory. The progress was a major achievement, not because new technologies had been invented or a thorny engineering problem solved. The Trans-Siberian's heroic distinction is that a poor country succeeded in building a railway across Siberia, albeit one that was markedly behind the technological standard of the day.
They were building a railroad by hand across the subarctic Siberia at the same time that the Wright brothers were dreaming of powered flight. At the very same time that in the US, the New York Central Railroad exceeded 100 miles an hour. The Russians are aspiring to a railroad that would operate at 10 or 15 miles an hour, take several weeks to cross the continent.
Far from the royal celebration, the real heroes, the men who laid the tracks, continued to work, unheralded and invisible to the national eye. They drove the railroad forward day after day, overcoming whatever is in the railroad's path. That included a forest as large as the continental United States. The birch, pine, and spruce were so dense, sunlight had never reached the ground. When the sun finally touched the frozen forest floor, it turned it into a boundless swamp. The men had no choice but to work in hip-deep water and wallow in mud until drainage canals were built. The work moved slowly, but it never stopped. By 1900, the railroad was finished, except for a final link less than 200 miles long. The last stretch, joining the western and eastern sections, was in Central Asia at Lake Baikal, the world's largest body of fresh water. The lake is 400 miles long and 60 miles across. It also reaches depths of over a mile, making it the deepest lake on Earth. Cliffs and mountains rim the southern and eastern shores like the teeth of a shark. The landscape was a construction crew's nightmare. Of the route's 6,000 miles, most had crossed Great Plains like the American Midwest or forests and swamps. But this section was pain and heartache embodied in every mile. Out of this terrain, crews had to blast a shelf wide enough for the tracks and tunnel through a mountain chain. The cost was $15 million, 6 times that of an average mile. The Railroad Committee's decision was unanimous. There had to be an easier way. The Railroad Committee decided to avoid the route through the mountains and build a train ferry to cross the waters of Lake Baikal. The idea is copied from the Americans.
This is not an unusual thing to do. It was used a lot in the United States in the early days, even until the 1970s. to get trains across Lake Michigan to avoid the congestion of Chicago. But at Lake Baikal, what they did was propose a ferry to take the train across because they would be quicker than to build the line all the way around the south end of the lake.
The vessel that would cross the lake was named the Baikal. It was designed and built in England, 297 feet long by 57 feet wide. It had twin propellers, an inch-thick steel hull reinforced by a 2-foot inner sheathing of timber, and a bow propeller to shear away ice. When the ship was finished, it broke through ice 4 feet thick. It was one of the biggest and most powerful train ferries in the world, built to carry 1,200 passengers, 28 fully loaded boxcars, and 12 locomotives at a speed of 13 knots. 3 rows of tracks rested above the ship's keel so a train could drive on and off the ferry. It was the one state-of-the-art item on the Trans-Siberian Railway. A smaller icebreaker and passenger ferry named the Angara was also built. Its job was to plow ahead of the Baikal, breaking a path for it. The train ferry was finished in 12 months, but the only way to get the vessel to Siberia and Lake Baikal was to break it down, box it, ship it by boat, then rail, and reassemble it at its new port, Litsvianka. Reaching a landlocked port in Central Asia proved to be more difficult than construction. The Baikal was delayed by 2 years when its supply train had to wait until a bridge was constructed. In the drawn-out delay, parts were lost in transit. Then it was discovered that some ship pieces were too big to fit on the supply train and had to be rebuilt, causing a further loss of time.
It had 15 boilers. The reason for that is they couldn't have any one of these boilers any bigger than would fit on a railroad car to carry it down the track and get it to Irkutsk and finally get it to the place where the boat was being assembled.
3 more years passed before the ship was finally reassembled and put into service. But the waste of time was a minor inconvenience compared to what was in store for the Baikal.
Perhaps one of the biggest surprises in all of Siberia was Lake Baikal. Even the Russians underestimated winter in Siberia, winter on Lake Baikal. The lake seemed to have a life of its own. It had its own weather, it had its own moods, it had its own hazards and its own beauties. Storms could come up almost instantly, storms large enough to throw this immense car ferry, this iron boat, big enough to sail any ocean in the world, far enough off course and stop it in its wake.
After 1 year on the lake, the Baikal proved itself useless. It was a total loss. In spring, summer, and fall, storms or fog constantly held the Baikal in port. In winter, it was unable to break through the ice. The hydrographers assigned to measure the thickness of the ice had drawn incorrect measurements. In the dead of winter, the ice rose to 9 feet, not 4. In futile desperation, men were sent onto the ice to hack a path for the ferry, but it was useless.
This whole huge bloody ship slides up on top of the ice, fails to break through, slides back. I mean, it just flat doesn't work. And so passengers and cargoes and stuff are piling up at either side of the lake. You just physically can't get across. It's just, a bloody, ill-conceived mess. Your whole railroad from Moscow to Vladivostok ceases to be able to run.
Lake Baikal had the final word. The ferries were abandoned in a year, a frost-rimmed memento of Siberia's power over men and machines. The Railroad Committee had no alternative but to build a 162-mile track through the mountains and cliffs above the lake. The undertaking rivaled the most difficult stretch of track ever built. It required no less than 38 tunnels through sheer granite mountains. The only relief was that at long last, the Trans-Siberian was almost finished. Vladivostok, Russia's easternmost city, 6,000 miles and 8 time zones from Moscow. It is the hub of the Pacific Fleet, even though the warships are less at sea and more at anchor in the post-Cold War era. In Soviet times, it was a restricted city. Without government permission, no one was allowed to enter or leave. But those days are over. The Trans-Siberian Railroad reaches Vladivostok uninspected by secret police 8 days after it leaves the capital. It arrives at the station where young Prince Nicholas inaugurated the project in 1891 amid so much hope and fanfare. A decade after construction began, the Trans-Siberian was once again steeped in excited anticipation. Crews prepared to drive the railroad to completion. But first, they had to challenge the formidable cliffs and mountains around it, turning rock into a railway 162 miles long. This section of track surpassed any of the challenges that once confronted the builders of America's transcontinental railroad. Not only was it more difficult by virtue of the landscape, it had none of America's state-of-the-art equipment. The most difficult construction on the Trans-Siberian, and arguably in all of railroading, had to rely instead on brute strength, determination, and hand tools. That's all crews had to build 38 tunnels through a mountain chain that rises 1,500 feet above a lake the size of an ocean in central Siberia.
Elsewhere in the world, at the beginning of the 20th century, tunneling was considered high technology. There were pneumatic drills, there were high explosives, there were tunneling machines invented in Europe and the United States that often made fairly short work of solid rock. Russia built these tunnels the hard way, the old-fashioned way, with hand drills, with sweaty men with hammers working inside cramped, rocky tombs, making holes in the rock into which the blasters would tap their powder, insert the dynamite sticks, and light the fuses and run as fast as they could. This was tunneling 1850 style. The trouble was, this was the early 20th century.
In spite of the hardships in building the link past Lake Baikal, the railroad inched onward to completion. Builders estimated the railroad's finale in the spring of 1904, 14 years after it began in Vladivostok. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II eagerly awaited the train's successful completion with all the pride and excitement of a new father. With the last mile only months away, he prepared a celebration, boasting to a world audience that the railroad had bridled Asia in steam and iron at last. He also lavished the railroad in bravado, flaunting it as a tool of empire and bragging it marked a new era of Russian military prowess in the Far East. The Tsar would have been better off to say nothing at all. His unmeasured speech and lack of tact sparked a cataclysmic disaster. On February 8, 1904, Japan launched a sneak attack on Russia's Pacific coast to destroy the Trans-Siberian Railroad and break St. Petersburg's link to the east. The Japanese deliberately struck in the dead of winter when the train was most vulnerable. But to Russia and the Tsar's horror, the Trans-Siberian was not just vulnerable up and down its 6,000 miles. It was a death trap. Its light rails broke down, unable to bear the weight of boxcars overloaded with weapons and soldiers.
Well, there's a great line about the Trans-Siberian that kind of got coined fairly early, and that is a first-rate, third-rate railroad. And the third-rate part meant just everything was cheap. They would begin to do the grading instead of a sturdy basis. You know, it'd be a pile of dirt and cheap green wood for the ties, pretty cheap and soft iron for the rails. And you get a railroad for a while, and then come derailments, come washouts. I mean, there was a derailment every few weeks.
The policy of building quick and cheap was a disaster in the exigency of war.
They built it, first of all, single-tracked to save money, with the result that during the war they couldn't send troops to China at the same time that they were bringing wounded troops out of China. The lines were constantly clogged. Within 10 years of the initial construction, they began reconstructing the entire railroad.
The war ended a year later in defeat for the Tsar and the railroad. The Trans-Siberian was blamed as one of the reasons for Russia's ignominious defeat. A painstaking process of rebuilding began. Finally, by 1916, the railroad was finished. Russia had its long-desired transcontinental railroad, but there was no celebration.
Well, I suppose in one way you could call building this railroad like the 30 Years' War. It's a great dream. It obviously has lots of aspects of empire. But in the end, it becomes this connection between a nation whose geography is so vast that by the time they finally get to the end, a decade later, everyone is just exhausted.
The railroad and the war depleted the national treasury. There was no capital to fund social programs, making bad times in Russia worse. It also prevented the government from modernizing the army. When World War I broke out, Russia was ill-equipped and suffered horrible casualties. The troubles at the front, its problems at home, led to an insurmountable crisis, and ultimately, the Russian Revolution. The promise of the railroad to bring peace and prosperity, once used to justify its enormous ambition, went unfulfilled.
There was almost a utopian vision behind this railroad, that it would solve all of the problems of Russia, that it would bring Russia into the center of world trade, and none of it came to pass.
Nicholas II, who proudly inaugurated the railroad's construction, had his final glimpse of St. Petersburg from a window on the train. Under cover of darkness, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, once the hope of the Romanov family, carried Nicholas II to his death in Siberia. In years that followed, the Tsar's once rickety train grew into a mighty railroad when money and time were added to improve it. In the Russian Civil War, the communists used the Trans-Siberian to consolidate power across the country. During World War II, it rushed fresh soldiers to the battlefronts, turning the tide of the war against Hitler. In the 1950s, the industrial might of the Soviet Union turned the railroad into a state-of-the-art masterpiece. By the end of the decade, the communists upgraded the Trans-Siberian with heavy steel rails, new cross ties, new bridges, and a second track. The result is one of the world's strongest and most durable railways.
This was in every way a handmade, hard-won, difficult project that took a toll in time and money and blood.
The railway the Tsar desperately wanted, but could barely afford, had fulfilled its promise a century after the first crews struggled to build it. A relic of a time gone by, when strength on strength, more than any single ingredient, triumphed in building the world's longest railroad across a hostile wilderness.
Get ready for war under the command of Moses, Abraham, King David. You wouldn't think it, but these were the men who led thousands into battle.
With the strike of the sword, you would hear the screams of terror. This is all very bloody business.
It's time to examine the Old Testament from a military perspective. Bible Battles, tonight at 10 on History.